I have, it's good to know. It's been uh, uh, an honor and a privilege to be invited to be with you to the Canadian Association of Baptist Freedoms. Um, I should first say that I have some Amherst connections. So I served for 9 years in the Department of Community Services Child Welfare Services here in Cumberland County. We were a private agency then, Family and Children's Services of Cumberland County, and it wasn't until after I left that the department kind of took over child welfare service delivery directly and did away with private child welfare agencies. Perhaps tonight I won't share with you what my opinion of that is in its, maybe we'll share that another day. But for 9 years I was here. I first came as a casework supervisor, and then through a comedy of errors, I ended up as the acting executive director and then the executive director. And I was privileged to work with folk here in the community, in education and in health and in justice. Working to support struggling children, youth, and families in Cumberland County, and it was really a key moment in my career. I was relatively young, and it was formative. And I used to say that I worked in the best child welfare agency in Canada. We certainly did. Some of the best child welfare in Nova Scotia. We certainly, in Nova Scotia, do the best child welfare in Canada. And so I said, we do the best child welfare. I claimed that for us. And I had a team of individuals that I literally could have led into hell cheerfully. And we went up to the gates on several occasions. so I think very fondly of that time. I should also say that I have some Baptist affiliation. I was raised in a family that I guess I'd say I was raised in the Black Baptist tradition. I say tradition because our family was not a church-going family, but only gospel music could be played in my home on Sundays. And we were certainly a family of people who were taught to believe in God. And my mother very beautifully sent us off to Sunday school on the bus that came through the public housing unit that we lived in, and she gathered us up on the bus, or we were gathered, and we were taken to a church, and so for probably 6 years, I attended a Sunday school, and being the precocious religious kid that I was, by the time I was 12, I had read my Bible through twice and decided that the things I was reading about weren't the things they were teaching about. And so I separated myself at the age of 12 from that congregation. Can you imagine? 12 years old making a decision like that, really? And that church was a reprieve from my circumstances of living in a public housing unit. And that in those days, we think of those spaces being difficult now, but in those days, when I was 6 and 7 years old, police were regularly in our community every weekend with helmets and shin pads and boots to their knees. So it was a different time. I was homeless as far as church was concerned for a couple of years, and then later on, I affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I joined that church consciously as a person who was pursuing faith, and served and worshiped and joined that church. And for 20 years, I served as a lay preacher, an elder, an acting pastor, and led communion, did everything but baptize folk within that fellowship, served on regional and national and international commissions of the church. And then, like I said, 20 years in, my marriage ended, separated and divorced, and I came out as gay. And I'm not sure if I left the church or if the church left me at that point. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not an affirming denomination. And I slowly left the church. I had left Amherst and went back to Halifax and uh, was drawn into church leadership very quickly before I had a chance to get oriented, and realized after a while there's a lack of integrity serving here and being gay, because it requires a degree of closetedness that was inconsistent with living a life of integrity. And so by that time, I was already organizing all of the Bible study leaders in the church and all of the pastoral assignments, the pulpit assignments. And so I sat down and I wrote out the schedule for the next year, and very conspicuously left myself off of the schedule and called my pastor and said, Pastor, we should have a conversation. And I told him I wouldn't be preaching or teaching, and that I would be figuring out my situation. A much younger man than I at that time, he kind of stammered and stuttered. And I did both my university degrees in religious institutions and have theological education, so he wasn't going to debate the issue with me. But he called me about 4 weeks later and said, Robert, I'm going to be, I've got to change the schedule. I've got to go out of the province. I've been asked to speak at this convention, and I'm wondering if you'd preach for me on this particular Sabbath. And I said, sure. As soon as you can tell me how you're able to ask the gay brother to preach. And after some kind words, he hung up and didn't call back to extend that invitation. And then I was homeless again, for as far as church is concerned, for many years. Until fairly recently, I've begun to affiliate with the Queer Spirit Church that is resident at First Baptist Church in Halifax, and have been kind of worshiping there once a month and serving somewhat there. And this semester I teach on Wednesday evenings, so it's been a little bit, I've been disoriented this since September, but I feel again like I have been able to honor the call of service that has been placed on my life, and I've been given again a home. So I'm honored by the invitation to join you and offer meditations on freedom. And as it was described this evening, I'd like to try. I say try because these things are never done until they're over. I'd like to try to share some meditations on the idea of the shelter of freedom, the comfort we draw from freedom and what it does for us, what it offers for us, and what freedom is when we think about freedom from a faith perspective. And then tomorrow, Lord willing, and time should last, I'd like to share some thoughts on the command of freedom. So you're free now, though. You've accepted that gift. How is it supposed to be used? And I want to be conscious this camera is right in my face, but I understand the utility of this, that the session is being recorded and that people are able to join by Zoom, but certainly it will have a location and a life somewhere, and perhaps someone somewhere will hear these words and in this space with us take the blessing that was meant for us in this gathering. So before I go further, would you mind if we just bow our heads and pray to Him? Creator God, we thank you for the many blessings you so graciously give to us. We come to you as your children who are seeking to better understand the call that you've placed on our lives, and to better understand the freedom that you have given to us. And not just to us assembled here, but to all of your creation. Not just the two-legged, but those that fly, and the four-legged, those that creep and crawl, those that blow in the wind, those that swim in the sea, are all a part of your glorious creation and were created for your glory and to reflect your character. Help us to understand freedom as we seek to fulfill your will in our lives and in our relations with Christ. So the shelter of freedom. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about the etymology of the word freedom. That's where we should start. So freedom in the English comes from the middle or the older English, which is free, and this suffix dom, which just means the state of. And so we think of freedom as the state of being free. And I think that we understand freedom typically in the Western world as an absence of constraint. So I'm an African Nova Scotian. So freedom has a very particular meaning for people who are the descendants of enslaved people. I am free, no longer enslaved. But the word really, we have to go a little bit further back in its etymology. And etymologists are really kind of speculating about things, but they say that this word free in the English comes from an Indo-European word, priya. And if you know a lot of folk who are South Asian, you know that priya is a very common name. Right? And priya is a word that means dear one, beloved, or love. And so if we go back that far, we can say that freedom then is the state of being loved. Now we'll leave it to etymologists and the folk who create the Oxford English Dictionary to tell the tale of how they think the meaning of that term got transmitted from the idea of the state of being loved to the state of enslavement. But if you want a little bit if you deep dive into that, you can read a book written by Alison Weir of the University of Toronto. I believe she's an Indigenous scholar there. And she wrote a book called Decolonizing Freedom, because she critiques the idea of freedom as being this thing that is the state of not being constrained or the state of not being enslaved, and says that that is really a colonial idea that rose when we began to experience classes of people in society, in Western Europe in particular, where there were individuals who were part of a ennobled class, and then those who were of a lower class, one could even say caste, whose lives were brutal and short. And so this idea of freedom meant that you were a member of a class of individuals that experienced certain privileges and certainly didn't experience the hardship and the constraints of poverty and lack of full citizenship. And so that the word then has come to be this thing that describes not being in the state of constrained or enslaved. But freedom, if we take its original meaning, the state of being loved, is then about knowing that you are loved and claiming the sense of worthiness that comes from knowing that you are loved. Toni Morrison, in her novel Beloved, some would say that story, that novel, is all about the idea of freedom and the layers of understanding freedom. The main character, Sete, she escapes from enslavement, and she has her children with her, and she goes north and she is in this state of freedom, but still struggling on the edge of survival with the threat of being reclaimed and taken back to the South to be enslaved. And there's that dramatic scene in the novel, and if you think about it in the movie, where the slave hunters are coming to reclaim her and her children, and she rushes into the barn with her children, and she kills. She attempts to kill all of her children. In a dramatic act of maternal infanticide. What is she trying to do? Preserve her children's freedom. And the novel seems to play on this idea that freedom isn't quite freedom. And one quote from that text is this idea that freeing yourself is one thing. Claiming ownership of that freedom is quite another. And so when I was meditating on this idea of the comfort of freedom, the shelter of freedom, what does freedom do for us? I wasn't thinking about freedom from the constraints. And in the context of the Canadian Association of Baptist Freedoms, of course, freedom from the dogma that constrains you even in worship and your ability to acknowledge others as brethren or sibling, like myself. But it goes beyond that. It goes beyond a freedom from a dogma and a freedom from a doctrine or a freedom from a convention that causes you to be less inclusive. It really is about understanding first that you are free, that you are loved, that you are beloved, and that that is your state of existence. And that if you understand that as your state of existence, then you have the ability to understand that that is the state of existence of others. And that they are also free. Why? Because they are beloved. And they exist in a state of being loved. And that that is the gift, that is the state into which we have been created. And nothing has happened since the Garden of Eden to change that fact. I'll say that again. Nothing has happened since the Garden of Eden to change the fact that we have been created in the state of being loved, and that our Creator continues to acknowledge and to give us the gift of that beloved state. And there's nothing that you can do or have done to change that. There is nothing that your descendants, your ancestors could have done to disqualify you and your lineage from that state. And there is nothing that an enemy could have done to have changed that state for you. This is why these days, when we talk about people of African descent in the state in which we do not say that they were slaves, we say that they were enslaved. But their status was never the status of slave. They were enslaved, placed in chains. But did that change their nature? No, it did not. They were still living in a state of freedom, a state of belovedness. And the fact that people in power did not recognize that is relevant to the question for us today. Paul spoke of this in the book of Romans, and let's be clear. I'm a queer black man. The book of Romans is troubling. But it's never sure why Paul wrote the book. Like he's trying simply to get into the Romans and promising to go, visit them. That was pure, or whether it was transactional. He was trying to use Rome as a platform for his further western journey into Europe. Maybe he was just home. But within the bigotry and the sexism and the homophobia that is existing in these texts, it is still the holy text that we as Christians, people in the Judeo-Christian world, well, perhaps the New Testament, the Christian world, take as our divine text. And God bless us, we have been given a mind that will help us to sort out the divine principles from the social history of the day, so that we can see in the text still something that is a glimpse of what God wanted for his creation. That's why I'm still a Bible, right? That's because of the poetry of it, I'm still a King James guy, but I'm not one of those guys who thinks that, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. I do understand something about biblical translation and how it came to us today. But I had a moment of panic sitting there, realizing, I'm going to read a couple of texts, and my other 2 pair of glasses are in the car. But let's see if we can do this. That's come upon me too. So in chapter 8, the Spirit of Life, Paul is saying this after the book of chapter 7, where he goes into this, the things I want to do, I don't do, the things I could do, I can't do, that all that kind of stuff that is. You almost need a pen and paper to follow it as he goes through that. But he's trying to convince these Gentile Christians that there is something other than following the letter of the law that has to do with our relationship with the divine. And after laying all of that out, he says in the first verse of chapter 8, there's therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of sin and free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin condemned sin in the flesh. So what is condemned in us? The sin in us. Are we condemned? No. That we exist in a state of freedom in relationship with God, a beloved state of God, a state that has not been marred, as far as God is concerned, by anything that has happened since he created us, since the divine, since the Father, Mother, God, Creator, willed creation into existence. Nothing has happened to change that beloved state. We exist in the state of freedom. Paul goes on later in the chapter, and I don't know, there are some things here that what shall we say then to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? He that spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? Who shall lay anything in the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Who is he that condemneth? Christ that died, rather, that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, peril or sword, as it was written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angel, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. The state of freedom with which we were created, with which all creation was created, continues to this day. And there's nothing we can do about it. We can mar it with our environmental devastation. We can go to war with each other and call each other enemies. And we can curse the God of our enemies, the enemies that also curse our God, not realizing that there's only one divine, universal creator. It's us that parse these things out. The sages of all faiths are in comfortable dialogue with each other. It's those of us who occupy the pews and the prayer mats that are in conflict with each other, not those who truly comprehend the divine. So, if we have been created in a state of freedom, and if nothing can interfere with that freedom, why are we all amiss? It's because of what Toni Morrison said. Freeing yourself is one thing. Claiming ownership of that free self is quite another. And I think that that's the problem. That there's a reason why one of the titles of the enemy is that of accuser. Because the things that you do, like Paul said, the things I should do, I don't do, the things I don't want to do, I do, all that kind of stuff. We live in a state of that reality. But we allow the accuser to make us believe that the things that have occurred in our lives have changed our nature and have changed the state of freedom into which we were created. And when we accept that idea that somehow the things that, whatever it is, the fact that my ancestors were enslaved have left me with this idea of internalized racism and a sense of lack of worth and a sense of joining a group called post-traumatic slave syndrome, so that even though my people have been emancipated for over 100 years, close to 200 years now, that somewhere there is deep inside of me a seed of unworthiness that pollutes my capacity to truly feel beloved and free. And that my siblings, who are the descendants of those who enslaved my ancestors, now live with a thing called white guilt and shame. That as we go through the process of reconciliation and consideration of the truth of our history, that enables or it incites within white folks a shame and a guilt that is something different than the state of freedom. I've been doing a little bit of work on the psychology of racial trauma. The racial trauma of Black and Indigenous peoples has been well studied now. Intergenerational trauma, Indigenous folks have brought us that. And the post-traumatic slave syndrome we have come to understand. I've been studying these things, but nobody has studied the trauma that white people carry from the history of racial politics in the Western world. And my Black and Indigenous colleagues say, "Ugh, careful of that, Robert, careful of that. You don't want to give white people an excuse." I say, I don't want to give white people an excuse. I want to give them an understanding of their state of freedom and belovedness, despite the evil history that we share. They say that guilt is the understanding that we've done something wrong. And guilt has some utility, right? If I do something bad to you and I go home and I feel remorse and guilt, that is the tapping on the window that is supposed to motivate me to wake up in the morning and go do something right, to make the wrong right. So guilt from that point of view has some utility. Shame, however, is not the belief that I did something wrong, but the belief that there is something fundamentally wrong with me. And shame has no utility. And it exists because there is an accuser. Now, when I speak this way, and in very religious terms, and thinking about these things, accept it however you like, literally or metaphorically, but the divine did not mean for us ever to believe that we exist in a state that disqualifies us from our deep and intimate relationship with the divine. I go to the Garden of Eden for my evidence of this. This idea that Shane and Seventh-day Adventists have a great kind of narrative of this. They say, that God created Adam and Eve in the garden, and at the end of creation, that everything was good. And that Adam and Eve were charged with the care and keeping of this garden and lived in harmony with all of the creatures there. And that it was God's practice to stroll in the garden in the cool of the day to greet his creation. And that it was the normal thing for Adam and Eve to rush to God to say, "Hey, beautiful day, thanks again. The tomatoes are doing great. The animals here we're enjoying their company, and what a sunrise that was today. That was fantastic. Thanks again for that. Can you imagine? You've all enjoyed a sunrise or a sunset, and can you imagine walking in the garden with the person responsible for that sun? Hey, good work on that sunrise. And this is the intimacy with which they held communion with the divine. And then after the incident that we call the fall, right? This is the story. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, "Where art thou?" I'm in. Where are you? I do this every day. It's about the same time. Like we're usually in conversation at this time of day. Now, do you think for a moment, if in this story, even metaphorically, the God of this story, do you think that God didn't know what had been going on? God watched the whole drama play out and still came to the garden. And Adam said, he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. And what is the first thing that comes out of it in response to the narrative? God says, who told you you were naked? Did I tell you you were naked? Did I delay my visit to the garden because I was somehow horrified by what you had done there in the garden? Is there something that you did that changed the way I relate to you? Here I am. I'm in the garden. There's no difference in you from yesterday to today. Yeah, maybe you did something over there. There's a tree, there's whatever, but I'm here to be in relationship with you, and there is nothing you could have done. There is nothing that the accuser could have done to change the state of belovedness in which you were created. And I am here as testimony to that fact. The state of belovedness is the state of freedom. And when you think about that, the state of belovedness is a shelter from all opposition. And all says that whatever we may have done or whatever may have been done to us, that our nature has been changed in what I have done. Whatever has happened, we still live in a state of freedom. Whatever has happened, we live in a state of belovedness. And so the shelter of freedom is the deep assurance that no matter what has happened, no matter what has come into our life, no matter what has been taken out of our lives, no matter what has been done to us in this life, we can live in that state of belovedness. This is the shelter of freedom. I have been privileged. I have been blessed to have been so deeply loved that it has made me talking. Poor Black child growing up in the inner city with a mother who loved him so deeply that I own the city of Halifax. You know, we lived for a time on Kennard Street, right across from the Halifax Common. So the Halifax Common was my front yard. And we were allowed, even at the age of 5 and 6, to wander as far as our yard extended, which meant the North Common, the South Common, the Citadel, the Wanderers Ground, the public gardens. We could not even go to Victoria Park, down through the hospitals. We couldn't even go to the Point Pleasant Park. That was our front. You know, I was born in 67, so we're talking about the early 70s. One could say perhaps traveling that deep into the south of Halifax was not so friendly a thing for a Black kid to do practically on his own, but I was beloved, and there was nothing, no fear, no hesitation, because I knew I was in love. My mother instilled that in me. Now I know our lives were complex, and my mother had, I was her fifth of 6 children, and she had had a very challenging life, but somehow by the time I came along, she was able to install that in me, and probably with my older siblings had some hand in that. And if they didn't have that, it's because their experience was different. I tell my siblings all the time, we were born of one woman, but we had each of us a different mother because she existed in a different state. My mother was joined by my godmother, the person I take as my godmother. Thelma was there. Thelma and Melvin was here in Carter Street Food and Furniture. And these folk loved me deeply, took me into their family when I joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I knew of a certainty that I was their mother. And it made me bold. It made me courageous. It made me a little cocky. I went off to do an undergraduate degree at the Seventh-day Adventist institution, and I used all my scholarship money that would have paid for my entire university career and left me some pocket change at the end of it. But I went south to Massachusetts and spent that whole cash on one semester education in a private American university. That's bold. You know, I knew free. I think everything is going to be okay. Sure enough, I got a job that kept me there, and I graduated. And while I was there, I met the third woman, Dr. Susan N. Fenton Willoughby, who loved me so deeply and nurtured me in the infancy of my social work career that it made me bold. You know, and from that day till this, I have said the same thing to every employer who's ever hired me, and that is, look, I'm going to come here, I'm going to work, and you'll never see the light. I can outwork any two people, but the day after you no longer want me to be here, you will not have to fire me. I'll go someplace else, because guess what? Other people love. Now, I never told the boss that I was talking about my mother and the fact that she had a sofa, so I would always land easy. But I was beloved, and it made me bold. And then later on, when I was here in Cumberland County and realized that as wonderful as the location was, I needed someone who could guide me in this work and help me both as consultant, coach, and therapist. And I reached out to Marilyn Pierce. Marilyn had been my boss when I was in child welfare in Halifax before all this, and she was retired, and she went to Moncton for work once a month, and she began stopping in on me. And so for 20 years, she was my therapist. And that woman helped me to unpack the injuries and help me uncover my belovedness deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. You exist in a state of freedom. You exist in a state of belovedness. That will not keep you from an enemy capturing you and placing you in chains and carting you away. It will not keep you from the constraints that can happen to you if you run afoul of the authorities, the increasingly authoritarian authorities. But the freedom will provide you a shelter from the belief that somehow, because of what has happened to you, or because of what you have done, that you are no longer in a state of grace with the divine. This is the shelter of freedom. And when we comprehend it, there will be no stopping us. When we comprehend it, you will rest like a baby. When you comprehend it, you'll be like that prodigal son after he returned home. you will realize that everything you thought separated you was never counted to your account. That is the shelter of freedom. And I believe that is what the Canadian Association of Baptist Freedoms, that is the gospel that we want to model and to share. God bless you. Thank you for inviting me to be with you this evening. And I hope for you a very productive meeting.
Well, you say thank you. A lot of things I was. Do we have time for questions? All right.
I have time for questions, but like they say in Parliament, it is question period, not answer period. So I promise you an answer.
You've got the power,
That's it.
and you've got the answer.
Well, I got grace. I passed from the state of being clever to beginning to apprehend some degree of wisdom. Just recently though, it's only starting to come to you.
We have a couple of people on.
Oh, yes.
On Zoom that might be interested in.
Oh, Rusty is with us.
The other is Ida.
Oh.
Rusty says hello.
Yeah. Any reflections on freedom? Any reflections on the things that have interrupted your sense of freedom? Yes.
I was wanting to ask you a little bit more about the white gilded shame. And if you don't mind, I'll take a few seconds to tell you why.
Sure.
I've dug into my genealogy way back to 1614. And I discovered not that long ago that my umpteenth great grandfather in Rhode Island was a doctor, and in consultation with other people, studying right and knowledge I understand, agreed with me that he probably had slaves. And I married Julian back in descent. And when I realized, oh my goodness, when I realized that my ancestors, well, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I wanted a little bit more about what you were saying about that. Like,
Well, I think the thing that we don't appreciate is that the history of North America is replete with tragedy. The colonial project had two main engines: the genocide of First Nations and the enslavement of Africans. Right? And so there weren't any innocents. It was the epic of the day. There was not just a legal ability to treat other people like they weren't people, but there was a moral imperative to do so. The papal bulls of the 15th century actually created the theology that enabled Christians to genocide and dispossess people. Now, there's always been warfare, but before that, people went to war with other people, and they fought on battlefields, and there were legal and moral ideas about warfare. And if you were a soldier and you wanted, if you died in battle, to go to heaven, you'd follow the rules, because they weren't just legal, they were theological, moral rules. But the church changed those rules in order to enable colonial expansion, which was going to require a different kind of treatment of people that you encounter that are not Christian. So we have all suffered from it. And we need to understand that even the people who were the oppressors in that state, who owned and enslaved other people, were injuring themselves by their acts of enslaving others. Because if we accept the idea that we were created in this state of freedom and relationship with all creation, then for you to violate the creation is itself a violation of your own sense of identity and worth. And don't get me wrong, Black people suffered more during that period than the white people, but the white people themselves were harming themselves. And the story that I like to tell that helps to illustrate that, if you'll do this little thought experiment with me, is just imagine in the period of time when in North America, Black people were enslaved, behind a big house, there's a little Black girl and a little white girl playing mud pies. And they hear in the distance a ruckus. And so they grab each other's hands like they do every single day when they're playing and enjoying each other's company. And they run around the side of the house and they see the father of the white man whipping the father of the father of the white girl whipping the father of the Black girl. The Black girl, in order for her to preserve some element of sanity, has to make sense of that act. And they make sense of that act by believing that my father must have done something wrong. And because of the state that we live in, this is what is happening to him. And later on, my mother and my father are going to tell me how to avoid a whipping by doing what is right. And that is the beginning of my post-traumatic slave syndrome, because I'm being taught that there is something about my nature that is different or wrong. It's different than God has created me. And so we understand the injury that the Black girl suffered. But the white girl's brain is doing the same thing, trying to make sense of this. And she must be saying to herself, we have been placed as a people on this earth for a purpose, and we have been given these other people so that we can enact that purpose. And my friend's father must have done something wrong. And so my father is just keeping the natural order and is fulfilling his obligation. Right? And that act, although it privileges that young girl, is perverting her inner sense of the freedom and the belovedness and the relationship she has with the divine. So that perversion of our identity is suffered both by Black folk and by white. The same thing with patriarchy. Patriarchy privileges men, but it has robbed men of emotional intelligence and deep sensitivity and an openness to softness and deep relationship, not just with their partners of choice, be that female, male, or other gender, but even with themselves and their comfort with being a man. So there has been injury in these things for all of us. Now, don't get this wrong. Don't get me wrong. I am not campaigning for reparations for white people whose families enslaved Black people, and these poor white people in their guilt, they need payment from it. No. That's not the way that works. Like, your people do reparations, are Indigenous people and Black people, but the injury is plenty enough to go around.
It's a moral injury.
It's a deep moral injury. It is a trauma that needs healing as deeply as the trauma of those who were oppressed. Now, in some circles, I'm unpopular for saying that, right? But you cannot contribute to the healing of the breach that that caused in our society until you heal the harm that has caused you. Because if you don't heal that, then all of your efforts as a white person to contribute to the solution will be motivated by guilt and by shame. Freedom, I've gone too long. Living in the state of freedom and allowing other people to live in a state of freedom is not just happy, happy, joy, joy. There, as any parent will tell you, allowing your children to be themselves and to have freedom and to work out their faith and their belovedness is a difficult thing to watch. But freedom requires you to allow them to do so. To try to control that process is an act that the divine did not enforce on us. Thank you for the question. It's a very courageous question. I appreciate it.
Any other comments or expressions?
Any comment? Isn't this a nice shirt? Ah. That's animal, vegetable, mineral. That's
I'm not sure I have a question, but a comment, if you don't mind. I love this sense of that state of being beloved. I've often said that, and I think I reinforced this through the COVID year. We were so devoid of things that gave us joy. And that sense of being beloved should give us a deep sense of joy. And one of my many mentors is that joy gives us strength. Strength gives us courage. And courage gives us hope. And that sense of being the beloved, being in touch with the divine, and being embraced by that, no matter our status, gives us strength, which gives us courage, which allows us to live in hope. And my comment, I'm interested in your response. Written a thesis on hope and all and Christmas. Is that hope is not a state of mind, but an activity. It's the state of living now on the basis of what we want to bring. But without joy, we can interesting response to it. I'm sorry to preach.
no, not at all. No, I mean, you do that more than I do. So, I'm not really a theologian. I'm a social scientist who's religious and somewhat studied, I guess. But there is a text that was written by Thomas Homer Dixon. I'm not sure, I think it is his most recent book. Thomas Homer Dixon is a political scientist and a conflict and peace specialist who was at the University of Toronto and left there to go to the University of Waterloo, I think, and then off to UBC. And he's trying to find himself. And I think the reason he's trying to find himself is that his particular take on the world is hard to confine in an academic department of study where the rules are so clearly defined in terms of what we can study here and what we can't. And his last book was on commanding hope. He's a guy whose thesis boils down to this idea relative to peace and conflict, is that when hard times come, a person will not starve if his neighbor is eating. Right? And I don't care how many locks you have on your door. If it all goes to hell in a handbasket and you've got a generator and food in your freezer, your neighbor is not going to starve and your locks are not going to keep him in. So hence conflict. Right? And he said, you know, when we look at the environmental devastation, we look at the global conflicts that seem to be rooted in such a deep history, that who on earth could think that we could unravel it in the time that we have left on this planet? He says that we cannot be deterred by the reality. We must command hope into a tool that will fuel our activities. And so hope is an active thing, right? It's not wishing idly, you know? A friend of mine and I in college used to do this thing to each other whenever we were talking. They said, "Oh, Omar, you know, I was thinking about you the other day, and I was thinking I should buy you a jet plane. You know, I'm going to get you a jet plane. I think that jet plane is just what you need to get back across the country." And that's what I was thinking. I was thinking I was going to get you a jet plane, but I didn't get it. But it's the thought that counts. He used to do this. And it was kind of like a thing that we did. We tried to each other every time we did. It's the thought that counts. It's not the thought that counts. It's what you do with your hope. And that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow in terms of what is the command of freedom? What does it require us? If you comprehend the depth of belovedness that you have, that you are, is that just going to empower you to skip a little lighter in your day? Is it just going to empower you to nap easier in the middle of the day? Or is it going to require something of you?
Here's the question.
Yeah.
Ultimately, isn't the great gift of freedom, as you have described it, something which ultimately doesn't constrain us but creates an obligation to be truly free to lose that freedom, because it creates an obligation to see others saving these themselves. Isn't that paradox?
Yeah. That's tomorrow. That is my belief.
Yeah.
You know,
But I'm okay with it.
if I've raised a daughter who we were chatting on my drive up here. She's 31. And just, conscious of this recording going out into the ether. Let's just say that I'm a black man with a black daughter and she gave me a run for my money. Right? Of course, I was a director of child welfare, so I had some skills, but the skills seem sometimes to fall flat when you're dealing with your own home, with your own. And actually, on the way up, I said to her, coming here to Canadian Social Baptist Freedoms, talking about freedom, and I said, heaven knows that your parents have caused you enough injury that you'll spend a lot of time healing from that. But what I want for you is to be able to apprehend the depth of your belovedness. That has nothing to do with me. It's much bigger than who your father was. Right? Because that is going to make you unstoppable. She's already a force to be reckoned with, don't get me wrong. But it allows you to live with less internal struggle. Okay? With less internal fundamental struggle. Oh, there's always a struggle, there's always a challenge, there's always something you're trying to wrap your mind around, a problem to solve. But that's an external thing, not an internal thing. I can still have guilt and remorse. I've done something bad today. I did something bad the day before. I'll do something bad and inappropriate tomorrow. But I'll be reminded of it and called to do something about it, and I will. But I will never be the prodigal son who feels like he can't go home because he's ashamed of how he ill-treated his father. No. I will beat the path worn between where I am and where the father is. That path is well worn. And that gives me comfort. That really gives me comfort and courage and strength and obligation.
I don't know if you're going to go here tomorrow, but this creates all kinds of thoughts about how we live that out in church, as the shelter,
Yeah.
the refuge.
Yeah.
One of my favorite lines that I quote all the time is a marvelous line from Robert Frost. Home is the place which when you go there,
Yeah. And that should be how people experience church. And after coming out, I had a very clear sense that church was not home. Right? They didn't have to take me in. In fact, they were very clearly telling me I no longer belong. And nothing I had done in the 20 years previous compensated for my state of unworthiness. Right? And it's, if you've been in ministry, I served in leadership in church for 20 years practically. I knew where all the skeletons were buried. I still had a shovel. But that fact that I ministered to people in death and in life and tragedy with children did not compensate for the state of unworthiness that was simply my human sexuality. Right? And there was something profoundly messed up about that. And fortunately, I was able to understand that because through my coming out process, I don't know how, but I never felt disconnected from the divine. And that's not because there was something remarkable about me. It was because somehow, through the love of the people that I mentioned, I had a sense of security in the belovedness, the divine belovedness that was my state. I am, like Paul, I'm not speaking as one who is completely apprehended, but I'm pressing on. I'm pressing on. Look, I want to thank you for your kind attention and thank you for your questions and engagement. I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And again, like I said, I wish you a very productive, lovely week. Thank you.